is what you've discovered, to some extent, just the product of this lacuna, that if British patriotism is derided and traduced by our own intellectual elites, if you're told that there's something wrong with you for feeling patriotic, that's unsophisticated, you know, childish, then why wouldn't you opt out and say, well, here's a serious, you know, ancient tradition that's got a way of living?
Exactly right, but that ancient tradition is also one that interacted with Muslim society, you know, whether it's King Offa or whether it's you know, Elizabeth I and the first Brexit, as you often say.
One of my favourite stories, how we teamed up with the Islamic world against Europe.
Yes, and Muslims as a civilization are much more aligned with Anglo-Saxon culture for all kinds of reasons, you know, whether it's the secularism is not the laicity of the French, whether faith has a public, there are all hundreds of reasons which I go into in the book as to why there's commonality. But you've put your finger on something really, really important, Daniel, and that's when newcomers come here, what is here? What have they arrived to? And where's the welcome sign that says, you're off the boat, welcome to this country, and this is a country based on the English common law tradition, on Magna Carta. These are the freedoms that are complete red lines that we don't cross. Here we want to...
I think we've started trying to do that. I think actually Tony Blair was the first sitting prime minister to say multiculturalism has failed. The trouble is that making a speech is not the same thing as it percolating down into these armies of diversity and equality workers at local level who have an immediate professional interest in continuing the separation. And one of the things that you've been very much criticised for on the back of this book is you said, you know, in synagogues, people fly the flag, they say prayers for the royal family. You didn't come across any mosques where people fly the flag or pray for the royals. And you got some pushback from people saying, well, you know, why can't you be a patriot and a Republican, which is fair enough, of course you can. But I wonder, and this is a difficult point because it's a touchy one, but I wonder whether there isn't, if you like, an argument for slightly overcompensating. Let me put it like this. If you go back a couple of 100 years, 300 years certainly, there was a terrific prejudice in England and in Scotland against the Catholic minority. And it was very, very similar to the prejudice against Islam now, in this sense. It wasn't about doctrine. It wasn't about dogma. They didn't have a problem with praying for the souls of the dead any more than they have a problem with circumcision, right? It was, the real worry was, are they really loyal? Or might they, in the last analysis, be loyal to a foreign power? A foreign prince was the way it was always put in those days, meaning the Pope. Now, in the end, I think English Catholics understood that they needed to answer even the most baseless and unfair accusations with exaggerated patience. And so they made great play of flying the flag and praying for the monarch. And in the end, you know, the charge of divided loyalties was disproved by the number of Catholics on the rolls of the war dead, you know. And now it seems a bizarre thing that we ever thought that. But in the 19th century, the phrase that people use is they've proved their loyalty. Catholics have proved their loyalty. Now, it's much harder to make this argument because we're in a super sensitive, woke age. But maybe there's an argument, if you're an imam in a city that has had problems with social divisions, for overdoing it a bit and saying, even though we're being accused of things that we're not guilty of, we're going to go out of our way to reassure our neighbours.
Yes, and I think we're beginning to see some of those signs, but there's a problem with that sign, and you've highlighted that twice in your question. But before that, I also want to say that it was the great contribution of thinkers such as John Locke. You used foreign prince, I think he was the first to use that kind of reference to the Pope, that said as long as Catholics were loyal to the land and to the law of this land, they were welcome. And Muslims are the same, you know, they are loyal to this land, that's why they are here in such large numbers. But the problem is when a second generation and third generation is taught that what Roger used to call the cultural repudiation, everything that went in the past is wrong and to be poo-pooed, then you're saying to these young people that there's no land, there's no loyalty, there's no liberty that's worth defending here. The English language is just a mechanical tool for you to get by. It doesn't have its own long hoover of its own inbuilt power that commands global minds on every front. And once you lose that love for the land, its liberties and its laws and its language, then you're fair game, not just for Islamist extremists, I'm afraid, but a new brand of where that Islamist extremism is now side by side with a very far left, anti-West, anti-Israel, anti-Muslim world,
yes,
anti-moderate Muslim form of racism of low expectations that, you know, that combined threatens Muslims and threatens the West. And that's what we're seeing, this kind of Islamo-leftism, I think.
well, it's not against all nation states equally, is it? So there is a strong feeling, I think, if you see the world as a pyramid of oppression and privilege, then British nationalism or American nationalism is evil, because we've simply, by being top nation, that automatically puts us in the wrong. Never mind if we were spreading law and civilization and women's rights and, you know, but you don't make that argument about Venezuelan or Irish or Palestinian nationalism. That's fine. And, you know, politics is downstream of culture, as Andrew Breitbart used to say. If you're in a culture where the United Kingdom is constantly being held up as oppressive, wrong, racist, chauvinist, all the rest of it, then two things are going to happen. First of all, the people of the constituent nations are going to start groping back towards older patriotisms, as Scots or Welsh or whatever, English. But then where does that leave the children of newcomers who are not English or Scottish or Welsh, who are not of any of those ethnicities? And this, it seems to me, is a huge challenge for us as a country. It goes way, way beyond integrating, you know, second-generation migrants. It's about the whole country.
It's something that Roger used to talk about and write about a lot, especially towards the end of his life. There was this huge focus on the importance of the secular nation state. And he used to, I mean, I think he ended one of his books on, if there's a better model of living life, I'd like to know about it.
Yeah.
Because there isn't. The moment you end that secular nation state contract.
Well, he makes that point beautifully. I mean, it's in England an Elegy. And he says, he lists the accusations that are made against us of colonialism and imperialism, da, da, da. And he just says, okay, but where else?
Yes.
Where else down the centuries would you rather have been poor or female or from a religious minority or what, you know, where? Seriously, Ethiopia, you know, Persia, Russia, where? You know? And of course, it's a total lack of content. But just finally, before we leave Roger, he used to have this nice phrase, the politics of the first person plural. We need to have a unifying sense that when we say we are, you know, doing well at the Olympics, everyone feels part of the we. Do you think that the nature of the we will itself be changed by migration? Does Britain with a significant Muslim population, a significant non-observant Muslim population, is that a different we? Ronald Reagan used to say every immigrant made America more American. Right? How is it just a question of, look, you've chosen to come to this country, so accept, and if you didn't like it, you didn't have to come? Or do you actually bring something and slightly change the overall identity?
I think it would be unjust and untruthful to say that no, it doesn't change. I think it does change. I think we can't stop change. It's one of those great ancient Greek principles that life continues. The only constant in life is change. But it should be a change that is diverse and warm and welcoming and contributes to British greatness and opens new trade agreements and opens new frontiers to assert what this country has given to the rest of the world, rather than a change that undermines the we, breaks up the we, undermines the nation state and brings carnage and damage to our streets and our towns and cities. That can't happen unless that we is inclusive.
So we're having a
we have to be inclusive.
Right. So we're having a very sensitive conversation here, because there'll be people who'll say, well, hang on, you know, why should I change anything? It's sort of, you know, we were here first kind of thing. Now, there will be bits of the expanded we that I think are fairly uncontroversial. One obvious example is, I think we'll be a more Commonwealth-oriented country as a result of having large minorities from all Commonwealth countries who were always British subjects. But will there be a change? Will we be a little bit less, you know, whatever the next big social change is, whatever the next big equivalent of easier divorce or same-sex marriage, are we going to have a different attitude to that? Do you think?
No, I think in the strange way, we're seeing lots of young Muslims who are pretty woke. I don't think we're going to have a problem on those social issues. My real fear is on free speech issues, where people are afraid. I mean, I had 2 editors this week cancel interviews on mainstream publications because they're afraid of consequences of this kind of conversation, Daniel, that what it would mean for their producers, what it would mean for some of the listeners, and people don't want to have what's being termed as difficult conversations. But that's the very terrain on which change takes place. If we shy away from it, then the very racists and others that Roger always spoke out against own the territory. And that's why we're seeing anti-Muslim parties across the European Union that you constantly identified and battled against and trying to bring them into the political conversation. And that's the real danger that we
I mean, a very basic conservative tenet is that you have absolute free speech. That does not mean you should go out of your way to be unpleasant, right? The norms of conservatism, civility, courtesy, self-restraint, respect for other people, those are, you know, you don't somehow prove your virility by throwing all of those out of the window in order to make a point about free speech.
It's a form of extremism, which is not conservatism.
So you in fact, funny enough, one of the few ways in which I'll quote him in this conversation favourably, a point that Richard Dawkins made in his book on atheism, where he said, look, of all the criticisms that you can make of me, the silliest one is that we shouldn't have this conversation because it will offend people. It's precisely the important topics that we need to analyse thoroughly, and absolutely right.
Yes, no, we agree on this completely. You know.
So just coming back then to what you in some of your articles have called the Red-Green Alliance, because I think this is a really fascinating phenomenon. And the supreme example of the Red-Green Alliance was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This weird coming together of religious fundamentalism with aggressive socialist anti-colonialism, 2 things that you might have thought would have been naturally antagonistic, but which have fused around hostility to the West and hostility particularly to the UK and the United States. I think a lot of people, I mean, first of all, I think the Iranian Revolution is a world-changing event up there with the French and Russian revolutions in the sense that nothing was quite the same afterwards. But I think we focus too much on the Islamic and not enough on the revolution when we look at it, right? This was in many ways a classically revolutionary regime. It was anti-monarchy, anti-bourgeois, pro-nationalization. And it did, just like the French and the Russians, it did what all revolutionaries do, which is to try and replicate itself elsewhere, to send out militias and agents to try and get everybody. It didn't recognize the old rules. The Signature Act was the siege of the US Embassy. Your rules don't apply to us. You know, we don't care about territorial jurisdiction, national sovereignty, all the rest of it. Now, it's a very, very bizarre yoking together of different, it seems to me, of different traditions. One intrinsically conservative and in tune with human nature and based on practice. The other, revolutionary, like all revolutionaries, making no concession either to past practice or to human frailty. And yet, and you've written about this, we see echoes of it all over the world, including among some young British Muslims who have become, who have pressed their religion into a kind of anti-colonial wokery. Is that
and we're seeing manifestation of that again and again. I mean, Muslims from northern towns getting into convoys, coming down. They were just this weekend gone by, a huge protest in Downing Street. What unites the far left Corbynites with this emerging far right among activists in Muslim communities? I mean, you didn't see the elderly gentleman in the nice flowing beards from the mosques there.
No.
I mean, it's not the pious Muslim gentleman or the lady there. It's these activists from the far left and the Islamist far right united against the West. By the West, they mean our history and capitalism, something that the Prophet Muhammad as a capitalist completely forgotten. But secondly, against Israel. It's a strange bond, and they hate Israel so much that they're prepared to put aside the fact that there's deep fractures in that alliance on homosexuality, on the role of God, on their future vision of a society.
Yes.
And as you correctly identify in Iran, for those very reasons, the far left was expelled out of Iran and killed, and then Gaza,
it's
for
amazing,
those reasons,
isn't it?
for God and homosexuality and dissent, that they're killed.
You know, Orwell once said there is a masochistic tendency on the English, he always talked about patriotism, the English left, on the English left, that will ally with any cause,
Yes.
however vile,
Yes.
provided it is sufficiently Anglophobic. And in his day, he meant the Soviet Union, but or Stalinism. But of course, now we see it with Hezbollah, the Iranians, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, is that? But does a softer form of that contribute to the sort of default leftiness that you were talking about earlier, or is that just an inherited, a thing that kind of goes without saying?
A part of it is the fact that you talked about the void. In that void, I mean, who's offering a strong identity, a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of purpose? It's those activists who are selling Socialist Worker magazine outside universities and sometimes in outside schools that recruit those young people to a hatred of their country, to their own faith tradition. They don't realize that everything that they're doing doesn't just undermine the bridge on which they stand, i.e. modern Britain, but in the name of trying to attack Israel,
Yep.
they're also undermining their own faith tradition, because let's face it, none of us would be Muslim or Christian without Judaism. We're downstream. You talked about politics being downstream from culture. Islam and Judaism, Islam and Christianity are downstream from Judaism. All of those old Hebrew prophets are the very prophets that the Prophet Muhammad looked to, for his own ethics and his trade. I mean, we talk about a Judeo-Christian West.
Yeah.
It's not possible without the Old Testament. And what irks me, and not, well, I shouldn't say irks me, but I feel sorry for the young kids who are being recruited by the hard left to come and, shout against their own government and their fellow citizens without realizing that they're shouting against their own history.
So let's talk about solutions.
Themselves.
Let's talk. So to make an uncontroversial point, that even in the unlikely event that I've got any angry lefties watching, that I hope even they would accept, it is a very, very bad thing for any community to be identified wholly with one party. It's bad from everybody's point of view. If you, and this is true whether it's, Black Americans or British Bengalis or whatever, if you're owned by one party or you're seen as being owned by one party, the other party isn't interested and the first one takes you for granted. And once you have that, you open the door to corruption because you're voting for your guy, there isn't any competition. It's a very bad thing. So how do we get to more pluralism? Islam is the fastest growing religion here. If there was zero immigration from tomorrow, there would still be a much larger Islamic electorate 10 years from now. The demographics are already there. Since we're being indelicate, I think part of what we're seeing is just the nature of the migration. So if you recruit a population and put it to work for the public sector, in London transport or the NHS or whatever, that's going to be a left of centre electorate anyway. Shouldn't apply to their kids. Certainly shouldn't apply to their grandchildren. Right? And yet there's been this default. Now, I think there are problems. I think a lot of the blame here is the Conservatives. I think having lost the initial first generation, they almost gave up. But I wonder whether the answer isn't to rediscover some of the free market tradition in Islam, which we've spoken about, the Ibn Khaldun tradition, the tradition of the Prophet himself, the tradition of the Waqf as a sort of the creation of a space between citizen and government. The fact that Islam, and again, this is, I think, would be as puzzling to a lot of non-Muslim viewers as it would be to the kids selling Socialist Workers, but the fact that very unlike the other two Abrahamic religions, it doesn't elevate poverty. It was, 1,000 years ahead of Protestant Christianity in the idea that honestly acquired wealth put to good use is a good thing, right? Of course, yes. And I think that tradition is kind of gone. Is there a way? Can we excavate it in some way? Because I could see how I could make conservative voters out of groups in this country by saying we're going to take this very strong line on Kashmir or whatever. But that doesn't make conservatives. You want to get to get people, as it were, voting their values.
Yes, you're completely right, Daniel. I mean, those foreign conflicts should not be the mobilising tribal cause. I think that there are a couple of issues. One is for the Conservative Party to be able to identify what it is that it's conserving, and in that it's got to make an argument for family, for business, for faith, and for the very future that the elders who came here want to give for their children. And the moment you start arguing along those grounds, you're on making conservatives out of these people rather than saying, we'll vote for you because, you know, you'll give us better houses. Because I mean, Margaret Thatcher did that.